There are a number of ways in which the effects of climate change can be thought of as a justice issue. The most obvious one is that those most vulnerable to climate change are those who have contributed least to causing it. In a report released for the COP26 meeting in Glasgow in November 2021, Oxfam provided figures for climate emissions for 4 different income groups. The first group represent the top 1% by income internationally. To put this into context, this represents personal annual income of above about £40,000, a household income of £80,000 if there are 2 wage earners. The second group represents the next 9%, those with an annual income above £10,000. The third group was the next 40%, those with an annual income above £1,500, and the final group was the half of the planet with least income, those on less than £1,500 a year. Now let's look at the emissions. The top 1% are responsible for the emission of 15% of the world's greenhouse gases. You could argue that this is 15 times more than they should emit in a just world. The next 9% are responsible for 34%, which means that the top 10% by income are responsible for the emission of very nearly half of all emissions. Of course, this is the group in which most people involved in this study will be a part. The next group of 40% of the population are responsible for 43% of the emissions, which seems reasonably fair. But finally, the half of the world's population with income less than £1,500 a year are responsible for only 7% of total emissions. You can see here the clear trend. Those with high incomes are responsible for very high levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest on the planet emit very little. Another study presents the same analysis within the population of the United Kingdom. You can see that the numbers change a little because we're a rich country, the income divisions are higher, but the pattern of the emissions in relation to income is essentially the same. People with higher income are responsible for far more greenhouse gas emissions than those on low income. Another way of looking at this is in terms of those who have been responsible for the total amount of additional greenhouse gas emissions throughout history. This chart shows how this has changed since 1751. At the very start of the Industrial Revolution, the United Kingdom was responsible for almost all additional emissions. As time goes by, North America and Western Europe join in. By the turn of the 20th century, most of the Northern Hemisphere is at it, along with some of the more advanced countries in the South. Throughout the 20th century, we can see that this pattern consolidates. Generally speaking, the wealthier economies are contributing substantially more than poorer countries. Note that to this day, large parts of Africa, South America, and to a lesser extent South Asia, have contributed virtually no emissions. In a TED Talk in 2020, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, said this: "Over the past 25 years, the richest 10% of the global population has been responsible for more than half of all carbon emissions. Rank injustice and inequality on this scale is a cancer." This, by contrast, is a map of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. Here, vulnerability is a combination of exposure to change and lack of resources to cope with that change. You can see that those countries who are most vulnerable are generally those who have been least responsible for emitting greenhouse gases. Putting this the other way around, the countries that are most responsible for climate change are those who are least likely to suffer from its consequences. To summarise, climate change has been caused by the sorts of people depicted in this first image. Those who are least responsible and are also those who are most vulnerable to its consequences, the sort of people depicted in this image. Many of you will be becoming increasingly aware of the use of the term climate justice. On the basis of the facts with which you've just been presented, what do you now think we mean when we use this phrase?